Margaret of Burgundy harboured a deep hatred for Elizabeth of York, at least according to Sir Francis Bacon. He attributed this animosity to the belief that Elizabeth, as the wife of Henry Tudor, had become a mere tool in his conquest of the English crown. Bacon, however, was no admirer of the Duchess of Burgundy. He described her as possessing the spirit of a man and the malice of a woman. Yet compared to Edward Hall's assessment, Bacon's words seem almost restrained. Hall, a staunch Tudor chronicler, labelled Margaret an old venomous serpent and the diabolical Duchess, further condemning her actions with the biting remark that she was a dog reverting to her old vomit. The often overlooked reality is that Elizabeth was far from friendly with her formidable aunt. Even today, many historians portray Elizabeth as a sympathetic figure, an innocent queen wounded by Margaret's relentless hostility. They emphasize the emotional pain Margaret may have inflicted, suggesting she cruelly reopened old family wounds. Such views invite readers to sympathize with Elizabeth rather than Margaret, especially when confronted with this moving description. A mother of orphans, a nurse to the poor, and a solace for all grieving hearts. Surprisingly, this was not written about Elizabeth, but about Margaret herself. Jean Molinet offered this tribute following Margaret's death in 1503. Her grave bore an equally reverent inscription: "A marvelous and devoted patroness of justice, of religion, of reform." The stark contrast between Margaret's reputation on the continent and in England could not have been more profound. The reason is simple. Margaret acted according to her convictions, regardless of popular opinion. In this respect, she and her niece Elizabeth were alike, both women driven by duty and loyalty to their causes. Yet, when their paths inevitably collided, the clash was absolute. Welcome or welcome back to Lemmy History. In this three-part series, I'll explore the fierce struggle between Elizabeth and Margaret for dominance over the House of York, and, by extension, control of England itself. Each episode stands on its own, but I'd love for you to join me for all three. This is episode 2. In this episode, we focus on two critical questions. First, how did Margaret of Burgundy rise to such power that she became the focal point for Yorkist exiles and the mastermind behind at least one invasion of England? Second, how did both Margaret and Elizabeth navigate a world where the House of York no longer held the throne, leaving them as its most prominent heiresses? Two relationships deserve our special attention: Margaret and the Woodvilles, as well as Margaret and her brother Edward IV. Margaret of Burgundy was born in 1446, and for the first 21 years of her life served as a pawn in the hands of the powerful men around her. Her father, Richard of York, had long planned to marry her into the influential Burgundian court. His chosen match was Charles, the son of Philip the Good, and Isabella of Burgundy, who would later earn the moniker Charles the Bold. There were sound political motives behind this plan. Isabella of Burgundy was a granddaughter of John of Gaunt, tying her lineage to the House of Lancaster. Through this connection, Charles had a potential claim to the English crown. A marriage between Margaret and Charles could have neutralized this threat early on. At the time, the Lancastrian cause therefore enjoyed two potential continental allies, Burgundy and France, the latter through Queen Margaret of Anjou. But Richard of York possessed something that his cousin, King Henry VI, lacked: a daughter. He hoped to leverage Margaret's hand in marriage to bring Burgundy into the Yorkist fold. However, in Burgundy, the Duke ultimately decided, against his wife's wishes, that England was too unstable for such an alliance. The escalating tensions of the Wars of the Roses loomed large on the horizon. Instead, Charles married a French princess to ease relations with France, which had ambitions of annexing Burgundy. His first wife, Catherine of Valois, named after Henry VI's mother, died young at 18, leaving no children. Charles then wed Isabel de Bourbon, who bore him a daughter, Mary, before passing away in 1465. Isabel's death reopened the possibility of an English alliance. By then, Edward IV sat on the English throne and actively pursued a Burgundian connection to counter the Lancastrian threat. This concern may have influenced his decision to abandon marriage negotiations with France, knowing that even a French alliance wouldn't guarantee loyalty against the Lancastrians. Moreover, he couldn't afford to drive Burgundy away from him by wedding a princess from their hereditary enemy. Burgundy was crucial to English trade, and alienating the duchy could have inflicted severe economic harm on Edward's reign. At this point, Edward aimed to draw former Lancastrian allies into the Yorkist camp. His controversial marriage to Elizabeth Woodville aligned with this strategy, as did the renewed push for the Burgundian alliance. Edward even proposed a double marriage. Margaret would wed Charles, while his brother George, Duke of Clarence, would marry Mary of Burgundy. But the Burgundians rejected this plan, recognizing the transparent attempt to secure English control over Burgundy. All marriage talks were suspended. England briefly explored another match for Margaret, this time with Peter of Coimbra, King of Aragon and Count of Barcelona, but the negotiations ended when Peter died before any agreement could be finalized. With the Aragon alliance off the table, the Burgundian match resurfaced. By then, Edward had solidified his position. Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and although Edward still lacked a male heir, he believed it was only a matter of time, since he now had fathered a daughter, Elizabeth of York. This security allowed him to drop the idea of marrying George into Burgundy and focus solely on Margaret's union with Charles. For the first time, Margaret emerged as an independent figure in her own story. In October 1467, she appeared before the Privy Council and officially agreed to marry Charles. The negotiations concluded swiftly. Edward promised a dowry of 200,000 crowns to be paid in 3 installments. Crucially, Margaret retained her inheritance rights to the English crown, a detail that would later prove significant. The treaties were finalized in March 1468, and Margaret set out for Burgundy, where she was greeted with immense celebration. The wedding festivities, which lasted 9 days, were hailed as some of the most magnificent of the 15th century. Margaret met her mother-in-law Isabella and her stepdaughter Mary before she even encountered Charles. The women bonded immediately, speaking for hours and forming lifelong friendships. Mary, then 11, needed a mother figure, and the deeply religious Margaret embraced this role wholeheartedly. There is no evidence to suggest anything but genuine affection between them. Her relationship with Charles, however, was far more complicated. Charles harbored a well-known aversion to women, at times even banning their presence from certain spaces. He soon began avoiding Margaret altogether. Between 1471 and 1475, they spent a mere 32 days together, after which they never met again. Despite their personal distance, Charles trusted Margaret politically. While he was frequently away on military campaigns, pursuing his vision of a Burgundian empire, Margaret stayed behind, not just to raise Mary, but also to govern. She recruited troops, managed diplomatic negotiations, and even led the resistance against a French invasion of Artois. As a politician, Margaret was defined by 2 core traits: her fierce enmity toward France and her profound religiosity. Louis XI, King of France, had slandered her reputation, spreading vile rumors about her virginity and character to prevent her marriage to Charles. He allegedly even dispatched a small fleet to intercept her on her journey to Burgundy. This, combined with Burgundy's deep-rooted hostility toward France, cemented Margaret's lifelong opposition to the French crown. It also complicated her view of her niece, Elizabeth of York, who should one day become Queen of France, at least according to the wishes of her father. Margaret's faith, however, was not merely personal, it was political. In the book Women of God and Arms, Nancy Bradley Warren highlights how Margaret wielded her piety as a tool of statecraft. Her religious devotion went beyond personal worship. It underpinned her political strategies and public persona. From the day she arrived in Burgundy, she managed her estates independently, eventually establishing her lifelong residence at her palace in Mechelen. Around 1470, Margaret received a unique gift, a book titled The Dialogue Between the Duchess of Burgundy and Jesus Christ, written by Nicholas Finet. In this allegorical text, a fictionalized Margaret seeks spiritual guidance from Christ on how to live a righteous life and secure salvation. The work served as both a devotional tool and a political blueprint. At one point, Jesus addresses her directly in this way: "My daughter, you have long been, and still are, a great lady in the world, sister of King Edward of England and wife of Charles, Duke of Burgundy." He praises her dedication to spiritual matters. "Presently you do very wisely because you apply yourself entirely to devotion and to spiritual things, leaving aside all earthly pomp and ornaments to the extent that it is permitted to you." But the message is also a political call to action. Always advance the common good. The fictional Margaret concludes with a reflection on her earthly duties. "You ask what my task was during this time? It was solely the care of men and women consecrated to God. And what of the learned? To them I gave benefices on the condition that they observe sacred law. And what of the nobles? And what of the disciples of Simon? They were badly received because they were seeking something that is forbidden to give." Margaret embodied these principles in what Warren terms strategic holiness and diplomatic devotion. In 1470, for example, she and her mother, Cecily Neville, persuaded George, Duke of Clarence, to abandon his alliance with the kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and return to the Yorkist cause. Margaret also championed monastic reforms in Burgundy, strengthening her influence across religious and political networks. In 1480, she went together with the observant Franciscans to England, not only to promote religious causes, but also to broker an alliance with her brother Edward IV against France. Their dual role as spiritual envoys and political agents highlights the depth of Margaret's strategic use of faith. They had excellent connections about the situation in England, an advantage Margaret was undoubtedly willing to use. Her life took a dramatic turn in 1477 when Charles the Bold was killed at the Battle of Nancy, leaving her a widow. His death triggered a crisis. Although Mary was the official heiress, the French king, Louis XI, saw an opportunity to invade. In Ghent, local rulers imprisoned Mary, forcing her to follow their directives, and executed several of Margaret's close advisors to assert their dominance. Margaret likely avoided imprisonment herself due to her status as Edward IV's sister. Realizing that Burgundy needed a powerful ally, Margaret called upon Maximilian of Austria, son of Emperor Frederick III. Charles had previously agreed to a marriage between Mary and Maximilian, but financial troubles had stalled the plan. Margaret personally financed Maximilian's journey, contributing 100,000 guilders from her own fortune. On August 19, 1477, Mary and Maximilian were married. In 1478, Mary gave birth to a son, Philip. French propagandists spread rumors that the child was actually a girl, but Margaret staged an elaborate public proof during the baptism to the contrary. Her bond with Maximilian was strong. He had lost his mother, Eleanor of Portugal, as a child, and in their correspondence Margaret was often referred to as his mother, a title that reflected both affection and connection. Tragedy struck in 1482 when Mary died in a riding accident, leaving behind two children, Philip and a daughter, Margaret, born in 1480. She was named after our Margaret. In her will, Mary appointed Maximilian as regent for Philip and granted Margaret control over her own estates. However, the Burgundian nobility resisted Maximilian's rule, fearing renewed conflict with France. At one point, they even placed him under arrest. As a result, Margaret assumed de facto control of Burgundy, ruling on behalf of her step-grandson Philip. Throughout her life, Margaret remained deeply connected to England. She kept close watch over English politics, especially during the volatile years following Edward IV's death. When her brother Richard III ascended the throne, she actively supported his reign. Historian Desmond Seward notes that Margaret's agents hunted Bishop John Morton on the continent, though it remains unclear whether she coordinated such actions directly with Richard. By 1485, Margaret found herself at a critical juncture. All her brothers were dead. In her eyes, Edward IV's children were illegitimate, tainted by their Woodville lineage, and, according to Richard III, descended from a witch. George's children were barred from the succession, and Richard III's son had died young. Margaret's step-grandson, Philip, held a Lancastrian claim through his grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, but now Henry Tudor sat on the English throne, backed by France, Burgundy's old enemy. Margaret was furious. She had never renounced her claim to the English crown, and with the Tudors now in power, her determination to challenge them burned stronger than ever. Elizabeth of York showed little interest in her Aunt Margaret after Henry VII's victory at Bosworth. Margaret's earlier negotiations with Edward IV in 1480 had successfully sabotaged Elizabeth's engagement to France, and during Richard III's reign, no support had come from her aunt. After Bosworth, Margaret's palace quickly became a refuge for defeated Ricardian loyalists, such as Sir Francis Lovell. Elizabeth instead focused on securing her family's rights within England. Henry VII honoured his promises. On March 5, 1486, Elizabeth Woodville regained all her possessions. Just 7 months after Bosworth, it was as though Richard III's reign had never occurred, at least legally, for the mother of the new queen. Elizabeth of York herself was granted lands that had once belonged to Edward V, signalling her status as the head of the House of York, and revealing how the king and queen viewed the fate of the lost princes. A 1488 source indirectly confirms that Elizabeth received the Duchy of York from her husband, mentioning properties that would pass to her and her heirs upon the death of Cecily Neville. Elizabeth's closest allies, such as her chaplain, also benefited, receiving grants within York territories. Initially, Margaret Beaufort's name appeared alongside Elizabeth's in religious foundations commemorating the royal family. However, following the birth of Arthur on September 20, 1486, this shifted. Memorial prayers focused mostly solely on Henry, Elizabeth, and Arthur. Early portraits of Arthur notably lack the red rose of Lancaster. One even depicts him at age 11 with a white dandelion, subtly reinforcing his Yorkist heritage. Those who had supported Elizabeth during Richard's reign were rewarded. Archbishop Thomas Rotherham, for example, was recognized for allegedly exposing Richard III's controversial plan to marry his niece. Henry VII distributed grants to both Yorkists and Lancastrians, often placing Elizabeth ahead of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, in official records, reflecting her seniority as queen. Interestingly, Elizabeth and Margaret frequently appeared together in these documents, often in administrative matters, such as appointments within Westminster's St. Stephen's Chapel. This highlights a detail often overlooked: Elizabeth's expertise in organizing a royal court. While Henry VII lacked experience in this area, and Margaret Beaufort only had superficial knowledge, Elizabeth's familiarity with royal protocols was essential. Elizabeth's family was also considered in the new regime. Her sister Cecily, in particular, received attention, signaling that the broader Woodville family had not been cast aside. Henry VII confirmed numerous documents from the reigns of Henry VI, Edward IV, and Edward V, carefully omitting Richard III's name where possible. This approach embodied the Tudor narrative. Richard's reign was to be remembered as a grotesque anomaly. Later Tudor propagandists even emphasized his supposed physical deformities to solidify this image. With Henry and Elizabeth now on the throne, this anomaly was corrected. Henry eventually had Elizabeth crowned in 1487. Though her coronation had been delayed by her pregnancy with Arthur, an outbreak of illness following Henry's invasion, and the Simnel rebellion, it finally took place, symbolizing the consolidation of Tudor power. However, there was a lingering issue. England now had 2 York queens, Elizabeth Woodville, and her daughter, Elizabeth of York. Though officially Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville retained a unique status as the widow of Edward IV. Henry had inadvertently complicated matters by returning her properties, creating an unprecedented situation where two queens held dowry lands. Traditionally, widowed queens lost significant portions of their estates, receiving only widows' allowances, but the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses had disrupted these customs. Ultimately, two Queen Elizabeths proved too many. The matter resolved itself when Elizabeth Woodville retired to Bermondsey Abbey on February 12, 1487, where she remained until her death on June 8, 1492. Historians have long speculated about the reasons behind her withdrawal. Polydore Virgil suggested that Henry VII distrusted her for reconciling with Richard III in 1484. Others argue she lost a power struggle with Margaret Beaufort, or was implicated in Lambert Simnel's rebellion alongside John de la Pole and Sir Francis Lovell. However, these theories falter under scrutiny. If Henry had truly been angered by her actions during Richard's reign, his reaction came years too late. Furthermore, Bermondsey Abbey was hardly a place of exile. It lay just 3.4 miles, 5.7 kilometers, from Westminster, easily accessible by the Thames in under an hour. Elizabeth Woodville frequently travelled between the Abbey and court, maintaining her connections. The notion that she would conspire with de la Pole and Lovell, men who despised the Woodvilles, is implausible. The Tudors had restored much of what Elizabeth's family lost under Richard III, leaving her little motive to betray them. Some have suggested she may have known the fate of her missing sons and cooperated with Margaret to bring them back. Yet this too is unlikely. If Margaret had proof that the princes survived, she would have used it to her advantage, perhaps even arranging a marriage between one of the boys and her stepdaughter, Margaret. No such action occurred. Instead, evidence suggests Elizabeth Woodville planned her retirement. She purchased a house on the Abbey grounds in the summer of 1486, 6 months before de la Pole aligned with Margaret. She left court the day after her daughter's birthday, a personal milestone, and Henry VII later granted her a generous pension of 400 marks and income-producing lands. Elizabeth Woodville's withdrawal was a voluntary step, taken after she had secured her family's future. Her daughter sat on the throne, her grandson was heir, and the Woodville name had been restored. She continued to appear at important court events, such as the baptism of the future Henry VIII, but she recognized that her role in political life was complete. While it's possible Margaret Beaufort welcomed the Queen Mother's departure, or that Henry VII preferred not to be constantly reminded of Edward IV's legacy, these factors don't negate Elizabeth's agency in her decision. Her purchase of the Bermondsey house before Arthur's birth and her departure following her daughter's birthday suggest a carefully considered plan. Henry VII himself seemed to hold no ill will toward her. He even considered marrying Elizabeth Woodville to his enemy James III of Scotland, a move he would never have entertained had he seen her as a threat. In the end, Elizabeth Woodville chose to step away from politics, ensuring her family's legacy while finding peace in her final years. At this point, it is worth taking a closer look at Margaret's relationship with the Woodvilles. Notably, she never hosted any member of the family. Before diving into the inevitable debate over whether Perkin Warbeck was truly Richard of York, it's important to note that this topic will be covered extensively in the third episode. Let's postpone that discussion until next week. During Edward IV's reign, Margaret's attitude toward the Woodvilles was openly hostile. The king had sent Elizabeth Woodville's father and her brother Anthony to Burgundy to conduct diplomatic negotiations. As previously mentioned, their demand for a double wedding nearly doomed the entire project. The Woodvilles were well aware of George, Duke of Clarence's animosity toward them. However, as Edward's heir, George posed a significant obstacle to their influence at court. To strengthen their position, they sought to sideline him, especially after the birth of Elizabeth of York, which further solidified their family's status. This raises an intriguing question. Were the Woodvilles the ones who suggested to Edward that George should marry Mary of Burgundy? And if so, was this the reason they were sent to Burgundy in the first place? In this context, Dominic Mancini's observations are particularly revealing. The Duke of Clarence, who was next in line to Edward, displayed his anger more openly, by publicly and vehemently inveighing against Elizabeth's obscure origins, and by making it known that the king, who should have married a virgin, had acted against custom by taking to wife a widow. Margaret later blamed the Woodvilles for Edward's refusal to arrange a marriage between George and Mary in the mid-1470s. The Queen's family had seen firsthand the chaos George could unleash with an army and had no desire to grant him access to another. Their concerns were further amplified by George's deteriorating mental health. In reality, however, it was likely Edward himself who resisted giving George another chance to rebel. Still, she blamed the Woodvilles for the discord. Margaret's favorite brother George had stated publicly that his fallout with Edward in 1469 and 1470 was due to the Woodvilles' influence at court. When Richard III seized the crown, Margaret showed no recorded sympathy for Edward's children. While arguments from silence can be problematic, this absence is striking. In fact, she later went so far as to write to the Pope, urging him to oppose Henry VII, thereby also opposing her niece, Elizabeth of York. Clearly, Margaret was not one to conceal her discontent. Apart from her visit to England in 1480, Margaret's knowledge of the Woodvilles came almost exclusively through the accounts and publications of her brothers, George and Richard, neither of whom spoke favorably of them. Though speculative, I am convinced that Margaret saw Elizabeth of York, the princes in the Tower, and their sisters more as Woodvilles than true members of the House of York. This perception, in my view, best explains her behavior and the choices she made during this turbulent period. Henry and Elizabeth, meanwhile, worked diligently to counter this very perception in England. For the event of Cecily Neville's death, Henry granted all her possessions to Elizabeth before departing for war against France in 1492. He also deliberately transferred properties that had once belonged to her grandfather, Richard of York, further solidifying her authority and legacy. This move was strategic. It forced local nobles and subjects to choose between Edward IV's daughter and rival claimants from collateral Yorkist lines, such as the de la Poles. As discussed in Episode 1, Elizabeth was actively involved in managing her estates. She even nominated officials for her lands, with Henry formally confirming her decisions. This ensured there was no impression that she held her titles in name only, or that the king was sidelining her authority. Margaret Beaufort is famously remembered for becoming a femme sole at the end of the 15th century, a legal status allowing her to manage her own estates and conduct business independently. What is often overlooked, however, is that Elizabeth of York had held this same status. Parliament had granted her this right immediately following her coronation, effectively making her the legal head of the House of York. The only distinction between her and a male counterpart in this role was biological. Elizabeth skillfully used this authority to integrate her Woodville family into Tudor circles, echoing the political strategies her mother had employed 2 decades earlier. For instance, Cecily of York married Margaret Beaufort's half-brother, strengthening ties between the families. The most notable example, however, was Jasper Tudor's marriage to Catherine Woodville, the former Queen's sister. Additionally, George's daughter Margaret married a Pole, not to be confused with the de la Poles, further weaving the families together. These alliances forged a bond of mutual destiny between the Tudors and the Woodville side of the House of York. Their futures were now intertwined. They would either rule together or fall together. It seems likely that Elizabeth instilled this sense of unity in the young Henry VIII, for whose education she was largely responsible until her death in 1503. Henry not only idolized his grandfather, Edward IV, but also surrounded himself with descendants of families who had been close to him. The Bourchiers are a prime example. John Bourchier, in particular, was regularly summoned to the House of Lords and enjoyed the king's backing when he married into the influential Howard family. In this way, Elizabeth continued the political strategies of her parents, prioritizing alliance building wherever possible. Yet, she understood the limits of diplomacy. Margaret of Burgundy, for instance, remained firmly outside these reconciliatory efforts. The relationship between Margaret of Burgundy and her brother, Edward IV, likely broke down irreparably in 1475. Despite Edward's deep admiration for Burgundy, he even modelled his royal court on its customs, and his gratitude for Charles the Bold's support during his exile in 1470 to 1471, tensions between them steadily escalated. Charles, too, had reasons to feel slighted. Though married to Margaret, he never openly declared allegiance to the House of York, a decision partially rooted in his ties to the House of Lancaster. Yet, this neutrality frustrated Edward. In a subtle move to assert dominance, Edward sent Charles the Order of the Garter, expecting the Duke to wear it as a public show of loyalty. Charles complied, but the gesture angered the French, who viewed it as a signal that Burgundy was now a vassal of England. Edward sought to deepen the rift between Burgundy and France, and in 1475, war broke out, pitting France against the combined forces of England and Burgundy. However, Edward's unexpected decision to negotiate peace with France caught his allies off guard. Margaret was particularly incensed. She had been present in the command tent when Edward made his decision. He had fueled hostilities with France only to abandon Burgundy at a critical moment. Worse still, he accepted French payment for peace and secured the betrothal of his eldest daughter to the French Dauphin. Edward was not impressed with the efforts of his brother-in-law on the battlefield. He felt betrayed by Charles and believed the Burgundians had misled him about their military strength. Old resentments resurfaced, especially memories of Charles's earlier refusal to fully acknowledge him. For Margaret, this moment was formative. She had grown into a formidable political figure on the continent, someone who expected to be treated with respect. Edward, however, showed little regard for her authority. He didn't feel obliged to listen to her counsel, a slight Margaret would not easily forget. Yet, there was one consolation. Her youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been the loudest voice protesting Edward's decision. Though Edward dismissed Richard's objections, Margaret likely took note of her younger brother's stance, seeing in him a political ally who shared her perspective. The next blow came with the failed marriage alliance between Margaret's favoured brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and Mary of Burgundy. Edward had once supported this union but now forbade it outright. For Margaret, this reversal must have seemed deeply unjust. Just a decade earlier, the marriage had aligned with Edward's plans. While Richard's feelings about the proposed match remain unknown, it's plausible he disapproved, wary of granting George too much power after his previous betrayals. George's execution in 1478 marked a devastating moment for Margaret. Although her personal reaction is unrecorded, given her strong favoritism toward George, his death must have been a profound blow. Richard, notably, stayed away from the court's turmoil during this time, remaining in northern England. Margaret may have wished he had intervened to save George, but perhaps found some solace in the fact that Richard wasn't directly involved in his downfall. To Margaret, Edward had become the brother who would not hesitate to kill his own siblings. Yet just 2 years later, she was forced to set aside her resentment. With Burgundy under increasing pressure from France, she needed Edward's military support. Her advisors, the observant Franciscans, framed their appeals to Edward as a path to spiritual redemption, an approach that revealed Margaret's bleak view of her brother's moral standing at the time. Surprisingly, Edward agreed to send 1,500 archers to Burgundy, despite his reluctance. The reasons behind this decision are unclear, but it's plausible that Richard played a decisive role. At the time, Edward was focused on his campaign against Scotland and was unwilling to spare men. Richard, commander-in-chief of the war against the Scots, was called to the negotiations and may have persuaded him to support Margaret. However, Margaret soon faced another bitter disappointment. She had assumed Edward would fund the archers, especially since he hadn't paid her dowry in full. Instead, Edward informed her that she and Maximilian of Austria would need to bear the cost. It's possible he had always intended this, setting a political trap. By offering troops without funding, he could appear supportive while ensuring they would be ineffective if unpaid, thereby maintaining good standing with France. If this was Edward's plan, it worked only partially. Maximilian couldn't, or wouldn't, pay the archers, but the symbolic gesture of English support was enough for France to break off the planned marriage between Elizabeth of York and the Dauphin. For Margaret, this was the final betrayal. Her lingering ties to Edward were severed. One act crystallized this rift, the matter of her dowry. Edward had formally refused to pay the final installment after Charles the Bold's death, citing the end of the marriage alliance. In truth, he simply lacked the funds and had even considered reclaiming the dowry he had already paid. But Mary of Burgundy intervened, paying the outstanding sum directly to Margaret. This ensured Margaret's financial independence and permanently blocked Edward from using the dowry as leverage to control her. Returning to Elizabeth. The unification of the House of York with the Tudors under her leadership was far from seamless. Even today, one name continues to cast a shadow over Henry VII's reputation: Edward Plantagenet. The son of George, Duke of Clarence, Edward was effectively imprisoned in the Tower of London from an early age until his execution in 1499. Legally, Edward posed little real threat. Following his father's execution, both he and his sister, Margaret, named after Margaret of Burgundy, had been formally excluded from the line of succession. Yet, curiously, Henry VII did not strip Edward of his title as Earl of Warwick. In fact, he even granted him the additional title of Earl of Salisbury and personally covered the costs of Edward's long imprisonment in the Tower. Critics have long accused Henry of imprisoning and ultimately executing an innocent boy, holding him captive for nearly his entire life before having him put to death. The official charge was that Edward had conspired with Perkin Warbeck to escape the Tower, an alleged plot that provided the justification for both of their executions. Yet this explanation does little to absolve Henry in the eyes of history. I don't intend to challenge these accusations. I believe them to be justified. However, my focus lies elsewhere, on Elizabeth's perspective. We have no record of her personal reaction to the imprisonment or the eventual execution of her cousin. When they were both free, Elizabeth is believed to have had a cordial relationship with Edward, but with an age gap of 8 or 9 years, they hadn't grown up together, limiting the depth of their early bond. It's often speculated that Elizabeth was deeply shaken by her cousin's imprisonment and death, with some suggesting that Henry acted against her wishes. I remain unconvinced. Edward was not just her cousin, he was a symbol. Following the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, Edward became the highest-ranking male heir to the House of York. Though legally barred from the throne, Elizabeth knew better than anyone how fragile legal barriers could be. There's also the matter of his lineage. Edward was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, a man whose ambition and betrayal had once threatened the very stability of the Yorkist dynasty. If Edward had inherited even a fraction of his father's political convictions, he posed a latent risk. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about Edward's personality or how years of imprisonment had shaped him. We don't know what he said during visits from family or how he viewed his cousin, the Queen. However, it seems plausible that Henry and Elizabeth eventually saw no alternative but to keep him locked away. Prolonged confinement likely bred resentment and frustration, and there are claims that Edward developed mental health issues during his imprisonment. Regardless of his mental state, his mere existence remained a danger to the Tudor crown. His eventual attempt to escape suggests he had lost hope of ever being freed and was willing to risk everything for a chance at liberty. Elizabeth, therefore, faced an agonizing choice between loyalty to her paternal family and her duty to her new one. In some cases, this decision was painfully clear. I believe her heart wished for her cousin's freedom, but her mind recognized the threat he represented. Ultimately, reason prevailed. Elizabeth even supported the marriage of her cousin Margaret to a member of the Pole family, a calculated move that effectively neutralized another potential Yorkist threat. John de la Pole broke with Henry VII in the spring of 1487, fleeing England to seek refuge with his aunt, Margaret of Burgundy. The reasons behind his flight remain a topic of heated debate among historians. De la Pole became involved in the invasion attempt led by a boy we now know as Lambert Simnel. I will delve deeper into Simnel's story in the following section, and I plan to dedicate a separate video to him as well. Returning to the debate, historian Matthew Lewis argues that de la Pole genuinely believed Simnel to be who he claimed. According to Lewis, this is the only plausible reason why Richard III's designated heir would submit himself to another claimant. This conviction, Lewis suggests, explains de la Pole's sudden departure from England. His interpretation contrasts sharply with that of other Ricardians. Paul Murray Kendall, for instance, dismisses Simnel as a pathetic pretender. Those who disagree with Lewis propose a different theory. De la Pole aimed to claim the crown for himself, using Simnel merely as a tool. According to this view, Elizabeth's cousin may have been in secret contact with Margaret of Burgundy for some time, carefully planning the uprising before deciding the moment was right to act. However, the fact that de la Pole did not take his brothers with him hints at a more spontaneous decision. By fleeing alone, he left his entire family under Tudor control. An odd move, if this had been a long-planned conspiracy. Elizabeth's perspective is worth considering here. During his youth, John de la Pole was politically insignificant, despite being the nephew of Edward IV through his mother, Elizabeth of Suffolk. Though the king granted him the title of Earl of Lincoln at age 7, John received little attention afterward. That changed with Richard III's accession to the throne. John suddenly found himself second in line to the crown, behind Richard's son, Edward of Middleham. After Edward's death, de la Pole became the de facto heir, though Richard III never officially proclaimed him as such. The defeat at Bosworth, however, erased these prospects, relegating John behind Edward IV's daughters, who had previously been declared illegitimate but were now restored to their inheritance rights. Elizabeth's loyalty to her paternal family remained limited. By 1486, with the birth of Arthur, Henry VII's heir, the Tudor succession seemed secure. For John, this left only one path to the power he believed he deserved: armed rebellion. Margaret of Burgundy was the only figure both willing and able to support him. She had already offered sanctuary to Francis Lovell, Richard III's closest ally, and together they could pose a serious threat to Henry Tudor. What had once been a neutral relationship between Elizabeth and Margaret now shifted dramatically. Family ties were severed by political necessity, turning the two women into enemies. Just to give full context, during this time we can see the only time Henry mistrusts a Woodville. He had Elizabeth's half-brother Thomas Grey detained, who had tried to flee from his side to England in 1484, when Elizabeth Woodville had made peace with Richard III. A key question arises at this point. Why was there a Lambert Simnel at all? Why didn't the rebellion rally directly behind John de la Pole? There are only two plausible theories, and they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. First, it may have been a protective measure for the de la Pole family still in England. John's rebellion was already a serious act of defiance. Had he openly declared his claim to the crown, his brothers would have become potential heirs, and thus legitimate targets for the Tudors. Second, Margaret of Burgundy may not have wanted to concede absolute leadership to John. She undoubtedly had her own vision for an England free of Tudors and Woodvilles. This is further reflected in the strategic shift regarding Simnel's identity. Initially, Simnel was meant to impersonate Richard of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. This was a direct attack on Elizabeth of York's role as the leading figure of the House of York. Evidence supporting this plan can be found in French arms manufacturers' invoices, which reference a son of King Edward, a detail highlighted in a recent documentary. However, the plan shifted, and Simnel was recast as Edward Plantagenet. In recent years, Some have questioned whether Simnel was truly meant to be Edward Plantagenet, or even Edward V. Certain Ricardians still argue that Simnel was either the real Edward V or the real Edward Plantagenet, but logic rules this out. The real Edward Plantagenet had been paraded out of the Tower, walked through the streets, and allowed to speak with several dignitaries. Many people recognized him. After all, he had been imprisoned for less than 2 years. If Simnel had been Edward V, it would have made no sense to present Edward Plantagenet as proof that the supposed leader of the rebellion was safely in Henry VII's custody. Further evidence supports this conclusion. In his letters to the English people, Simnel never once claimed descent from Edward IV, a striking contrast to Perkin Warbeck, who consistently did so. Additionally, a document from York, the heartland of Richard III, refers to Simnel as Edward VI, not Edward V. Historian Matthew Lewis suggests that the Roman numeral 1 might have been added under Tudor influence. However, this theory overlooks how easily such a manipulation could have been reversed. It also raises a question: if Simnel truly was Edward V, where are all the other letters signed with that name? But I'll explore this more deeply in the dedicated Simnel video. For now, it's worth considering why Simnel's identity was changed from Richard of York to Edward Plantagenet. Again, we must speculate. Edward was the son of Margaret's favourite brother, George, and had been legally excluded from the succession. This made him easier to sideline if the rebellion succeeded. Crucially, Edward was alive, whereas Richard of York may not have been. Richard's name was a reminder of his tragic fate, which posed a strategic problem. Through Lovell and de la Pole, the rebellion was staged in Richard III's name, to fight under the banner of a boy who had lost his family, fortune, and legitimacy at the hands of his uncle invited public skepticism. It would have been easy to dismiss the claim as a lie. Moreover, Elizabeth Woodville, Richard's mother, was still alive. Her word would have carried decisive weight in the court of public opinion. These complications did not exist with Edward Plantagenet. The only problem for the rebels was that they didn't have the real one. They underestimated how big of a problem this was. Ultimately, it was Margaret who decided who Simnel would impersonate. She also oversaw his preparation, teaching him the basics of courtly behavior, and recruited 2,000 German mercenaries to support the invading force. In doing so, Margaret decisively fractured the House of York. As in Bosworth, former supporters of Edward IV found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. We know how the story ends. The campaign collapsed into disaster. De la Pole and Lovell had expected widespread support in England, but it never materialized. Outnumbered and outmatched, their forces were crushed by Henry's army in a battle that lasted only 3 hours. De la Pole was killed, sealing the rebellion's fate. As for Simnel, he was deemed so harmless that he wasn't even imprisoned. Instead, he was given a position at the royal court. Henry VII occasionally displayed him as a curiosity, but Simnel worked his way up from kitchen servant to falconer, eventually living out his days peacefully at court, even under Henry VIII. The failure of Simnel's rebellion cannot be fully understood without considering the role of Elizabeth. She embodied the living continuity of the House of York. Its legacy was present in her, along with the powerful symbolism of the old royal family. The Tudor rose would eventually come to represent the ultimate union of the houses of York and Lancaster, but at this point, Elizabeth herself was the key symbol of Yorkist legitimacy. Margaret of Burgundy took valuable lessons from Simnel's defeat. To succeed, it wasn't enough to send an army to England with promises of overthrowing the tyrannical Tudor king. The Yorkist nobility needed more than a figurehead. They needed a reason to defect. Even the North, which still held Richard III close to its heart, did not rise against Henry. Margaret realized she needed someone who could directly challenge Elizabeth's position, someone who could outshine her as the true embodiment of the Yorkist legacy. It had to be a figure who carried the weight of Edward IV and Edward V's lineage more clearly than Elizabeth herself. The memory of Richard III alone was not enough. To succeed, Margaret had to symbolically snatch the white rose from Elizabeth's grasp. But that's a story for the next episode. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.